Book review. Speak to Me of Home by Jeanine Cummins, an exploration of belonging, identity, and the generational echoes of home. Jeanine Cummins' Speak to Me of Home is an intimate, sweeping novel that spans 5 decades and 3 generations of Puerto Rican women shaped by love, loss, resilience, and the continual negotiation of identity. Rich with emotional depth and anchored by lyrical prose, the novel captures the ever-present tension between cultural preservation and assimilation in diaspora that remains politically and emotionally complex. It is a timely story of displacement and rediscovery that feels both deeply personal and universally resonant. Plot summary. Jeanine Cummins' Speak to Me of Home is a powerful intergenerational novel that explores the emotional and psychological complexities of migration, cultural identity, and familial bonds through the experiences of 3 Puerto Rican women, Rafaela, Ruth, and Daisy, spanning over 5 decades. From 1968 to 2023, the novel examines how the decisions of one generation ripple through the next, shaping identity, memory, and the very notion of home. The story begins in 1968 in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where Rafaela Cummins, bright and spirited woman from prominent family, makes the life-altering decision to marry Peter Brennan Jr., white American soldier stationed on the island. Against the wishes of her family and her own intuition, she leaves everything familiar behind, her culture, language, and homeland, to follow Peter to Missouri. There, Rafaela confronts the stark reality of assimilation. The vibrant rhythms of San Juan are replaced by the quiet sterility of Midwestern suburbia, and she becomes isolated and invisible, particularly within Peter's insular and often prejudiced family. Rafaela's journey of quiet resilience is marked by loss, not just of homeland, but of identity. She watches as her native language is diminished in her household and her children grow up more American than Puerto Rican. Her daughter, Ruth, born in the U.S., grows up in the 1980s and 1990s, painfully aware of her difference but determined to erase it. Ruth learns early that success in America often comes at the cost of cultural authenticity. She distances herself from her mother's traditions and language, reshaping herself to fit into predominantly white, English-speaking world. This choice, while giving her sense of belonging outside the home, drives wedge between mother and daughter. Ruth's story point captures the psychological toll of assimilation, the shame, confusion, and grief that come with rejecting one's roots in pursuit of acceptance. As an adult, Ruth moves to New York City, becomes a professional, and raises her own daughter, Daisy. But Daisy is not content with the fragmented identity she has inherited. Unlike her mother, Daisy longs for connection with her heritage. In 2023, she decides to return to Puerto Rico, seeking to reclaim what was lost. Cultural inheritance buried beneath generations of silence and displacement. Daisy's return is an act of defiance and healing. She embraces the Spanish language, the landscape, and the stories her grandmother once tried to preserve. However, her journey is violently interrupted by a catastrophic hurricane that devastates the island and leaves her gravely injured. The hurricane becomes a turning point in the novel. Not just literal disaster, but metaphorical reckoning. Daisy's injury brings Ruth and Rafaela back to Puerto Rico and forces them to confront each other after years. Emotional distance in the hospital, surrounded by the chaos of post-storm San Juan 3. Generations are drawn together in pain, guilt, and ultimately love. This reunion sets the stage for a raw, honest reckoning with the past. Long-buried secrets come to light, including the unspoken traumas that Rafaela endured as a young immigrant wife and the deep insecurities that shaped Ruth's choices. Cummins uses alternating perspectives to tell the story, offering intimate insights into the minds of each woman. The prose is lyrical yet grounded, rich emotional landscapes alongside physical ones. The contrast between the less sun-drenched vibrancy of Puerto Rico and the muted, gray-tone Midwest symbolizes the emotional dissonance experienced by characters who live between worlds. Themes of language, memory, and intergenerational trauma are central to the novel. Language, in particular, is a recurring motif. Rafaela's Spanish is symbol of her identity, Ruth's abandonment of it, sign of internalized shame, and Daisy's reclamation of it, an act of resistance and restoration. The novel also explores how migration disrupts the continuity of stories and traditions, and how reconnecting with those stories can be both painful and redemptive. In the end, Speak to Me of Home is not just a story about leaving or returning. It's about the spaces in between. It's about what happens to identity when it's stretched across borders, generations, and silences. Through Rafaela, Ruth, and Daisy, Cummins gives voice to the emotional truths of diaspora, offering nuanced, deeply human portrait of 3 women bound by love, memory, and the unshakable question, what does it mean to belong? Structure and narrative technique. The novel unfolds across 3 distinct timelines: the 1960s and 70s with Rafaela Cummins, the 1980s and 90s with her daughter Ruth, In the early 2020s with granddaughter Daisy. Rather than using linear progression, Cummins structures the narrative like braided river, weaving the women's stories together thematically rather than chronologically. This technique allows readers to draw parallels between generational experiences and witness how trauma, silence, and longing ripple across time. Each section is narrated in close third person, offering access to each woman's inner life while maintaining sense of narrative control. This stylistic choice serves the themes well, giving the reader emotional intimacy with each character without collapsing the boundaries of their distinct voices. Cummins often uses symbolic motifs, such as language, water, and the body, to connect the timelines. The hurricane that injures Daisy in the novel's present serves as climactic force, but also as metaphor for the emotional storms that have long battered this family. It's bold structural move that works. The pacing builds with tension, quiet reflection, inevitable reckoning. Characterization. The three generations. Rafaela. The departure. Rafaela is the novel's anchor, and her story begins in 1968 when she leaves Puerto Rico after marrying Peter Brennan, an American soldier stationed on the island. Raised in well-to-do family in San Juan, Rafaela's transition to life in the American Midwest is jarring and isolating. Her grief is not only for the land and language she left behind, but for the self she abandoned. In the process, she's too proud to show her sadness, and her husband, though kind, doesn't understand what she's lost. Cummins renders Rafaela's dislocation with devastating precision. The scene where neighbor insists on calling her Ralph instead of learning her name is both painful and illustrative of the subtle forms of erasure faced by immigrants. Rafaela never stops longing for home, but she silences that part of herself to survive. Choice that becomes the origin of Emily's generational rift. Ruth the denial. Ruth is a product of assimilation and rebellion. Growing up in St. Louis in the 1980s, she wants nothing more than to fit in. She speaks English fluently and never learned Spanish, shunning the culture her mother never quite shared. But her Americanness is always conditional. Marked by her name, her features, her mother's accent, her attempts to disappear into whiteness are both protective and self-destructive. Ruth's story is perhaps poignant in the novel because it captures the cost of cultural amnesia. Her emotional distance from her mother becomes metaphor for the cultural silence between generations. Cummins writes Ruth not as villain, but as someone deeply wounded by the absence of roots she never got to touch. Her resentment, especially when she becomes mother herself, is layered and raw. Daisy, the returned Daisy, the youngest of the three, is the most mobile. As a graduate student studying Caribbean history and identity, she is driven by a hunger to reconnect with her Puerto Rican heritage. When she moves to San Juan in 2023, she experiences a reclamation of self that neither her mother nor grandmother permitted themselves. However, her journey is interrupted by a catastrophic hurricane which leaves her physically broken. Hospitalized, it is in the hospital room, while Daisy is unconscious, that the novel's emotional climax takes place. Rafaela and Ruth, estranged for years, are forced to confront their misunderstandings, their unspoken grief, and the legacy they've passed on to Daisy. This setting serves as both literal and metaphorical ground zero, space where silence breaks and truth emerges. Their reconciliation is neither easy nor complete, but it is real, resonates. Themes: identity, language, and home. At its core, Speak to Me of Home is about what it means to belong. The novel examines the porous borders between national identity, cultural memory, and familial inheritance. Puerto Rico, as both a geographic and symbolic space, looms large in the characters' lives. Sometimes as paradise, other times as haunting absence. Cummins smartly never lets the island become romanticized backdrop. Instead, Puerto Rico, as complex and changing as the women who call it home. Language functions as both bridge and barrier in the novel. Rafaela mourns the loss of Spanish in her household. Ruth rejects it entirely, and Daisy attempts to reclaim it. Intergenerational shift in language fluency symbolizes deeper currents, the erosion of cultural knowledge, the survival tactics of assimilation, and the longing for reconnection. In many ways, Daisy's effort to speak Spanish again is quiet act of resistance, of honoring what was lost. The title itself, Speak to Me of Home, captures this yearning beautifully. It's both request and lament. Tell me where I come from, even if it hurts. It's a line that could have spoken by any of the three protagonists at different moments in their lives. Style and prose. Cummins' prose is lyrical without being overwrought. She is at her best when describing the textures of emotion or landscape. The oppressive humidity of San Juan before storm, the sterile chill of Missouri winter, the aching stillness of hospital room at night. Her metaphors are grounded in the natural world. Rivers, hurricanes, flowers. And this grounding gives her more poetic flight's emotional authenticity. Dialogue is another strength of the novel. Each woman has distinct cadence and sensibility. Rafaela speaks in careful, almost formal rhythm, revealing her internalized need to perform in English. Ruth's speech is clipped, guarded. Daisy's voice is curious and sharp, filled with the empathy of generation raised to question inherited silences. Setting. Place as character. The settings in Speak to Me of Home do more than provide a backdrop. They shape the character's inner worlds. Aunt Louie, with its flat landscape and cultural coldness, reflects Ruth's emotional stagnation. San Juan, with its vivid colors, sea breeze, and political unrest, mirrors Daisy's turbulent search for meaning. The hospital in the final act of the novel becomes neutral ground where past and present collide. Cummins also includes interludes that describe Puerto Rican history, migration waves, and social movements. These brief chapters provide important context without becoming didactic. They serve as reminders that the personal stories of Rafaela, Ruth, and Daisy are shaped by larger historical forces. Colonialism, statehood debates, economic precarity, and the long shadow of American imperialism. Emotional resonance and reception. What makes Speak to Me of Home so powerful is its emotional honesty. Cummins does not shy away from difficult questions. What do we owe the past? Can cultural inheritance be reclaimed? Is home a place, a language, or the people we love? Some critics may argue that the novel at times leans toward resolution too easily. The hospital reconciliation, for instance, resolves decades of pain in a relatively short time. But to demand relentless realism would be to miss the point. Speak to Me of Home is not about punishment, but about healing. It dares to imagine that wounds can be stitched even if the scars remain. Final verdict: Speak to Me of Home is a remarkable achievement. It is a novel that explores identity without cliché, love without sentimentality, and history without heaviness. Jeanine Cummins, already known for her controversial yet best-selling novel American Dirt, demonstrates in this work finer touch. More restrained, more reflective, and ultimately more moving. This book will resonate deeply with readers who have felt the pull of ancestral memory, who have struggled to reconcile where they come from with where they are. It's a story for anyone who has ever felt suspended between cultures, between generations, between silence and truth. Highly recommended.